There's a quiet shift in the ending of The Boys Season 5, Episode 6 that doesn't announce itself as important, and that's exactly why it matters, because The Boys has always been a show that hides its biggest reveals in behavior rather than exposition, in small changes that feel almost invisible until you start comparing them to what came before. And Homelander, in that final scene, doesn't feel like the same version of himself we've been watching across the series. He isn't louder. He isn't more violent. He isn't even trying to prove anything. Instead, he's calmer, more precise, almost detached in a way that feels unnatural for someone who has always been defined by emotional instability. And that difference, that subtle but undeniable control, raises a question that the episode never directly answers but quietly builds toward. What if something about Homelander has fundamentally changed? Because if you look at his arc closely, Homelander has always been powerful, but his weakness has never been physical. It's been psychological. His need for validation, his instability, and his inability to regulate emotion were the cracks that made him unpredictable and in some ways controllable. But in Episode 6, those cracks don't seem to be there anymore, or at least not in the same way. There's no hesitation in his decisions, no visible internal conflict, no moment where he spirals or lashes out impulsively. Instead, everything he does feels intentional and measured, like someone who has finally aligned his power with his mind. And that's where the theory of V1 begins to take shape, not as a random upgrade, but as the logical next step in the evolution of Compound V. Because if Compound V was the beginning, raw and unstable, and later variations tried to refine or replicate it, then V1 would represent something entirely different, not just more power, but perfected power. A version that doesn't just enhance abilities, but also stabilizes the mind, removes the emotional volatility, and turns someone like Homelander into exactly what he was always meant to be, not a flawed god, but a controlled one. And if Homelander has taken something like that, whether knowingly or unknowingly, it would explain everything about his behavior in this episode. The stillness, the confidence, the absence of chaos. It wouldn't just be growth, it would be transformation. And the terrifying part is that the show doesn't present this as a dramatic moment. There's no scene where he injects something, no reveal from a lab, no confirmation from another character. Instead, it leaves clues, subtle shifts that only make sense if you're looking for them. The way he speaks, the way he reacts, the way he seems to anticipate outcomes rather than respond to them, all of it suggests that he's operating on a different level now, one that the other characters haven't caught up to yet. And that completely changes how we interpret the ending of Episode 6, because it's no longer just a tense standoff between two opposing forces. It's something much more one-sided, because while Butcher is still fighting the version of Homelander he understands, the volatile, emotional, unpredictable threat he spent years preparing to face, the reality might be that that version of Homelander no longer exists. And if that's true, then Butcher isn't just outmatched physically. He's outmatched strategically. He's playing against someone who has already moved beyond the rules of the game he's been trying to win. And that's what makes the ending so unsettling, because it doesn't feel like a victory for either side. It feels like a realization, a quiet moment, where the balance of power shifts in a way that can't be undone. Because if Homelander now has something like V1, something that removes his greatest weakness while preserving everything that makes him dangerous, then there is no longer a clear path to stopping him. The emotional triggers that once made him vulnerable are gone. The instability that once created openings is gone. What's left is something far more dangerous. A version of Homelander that doesn't need approval, doesn't seek validation, and doesn't hesitate. A version that acts with purpose, not impulse. And when you go back to that final scene, when you really focus on his expression, there's a moment that stands out. A look that doesn't feel like dominance or anger or even satisfaction, but something quieter, something colder. It's the look of someone who already knows how this ends. Not in a vague, confident way, but in a specific, certain way, like the outcome has already been decided and everything else is just playing out. And that ties back into the idea that this isn't just about power, it's about awareness. Because if V1 doesn't just stabilize the body but enhances perception, clarity, and decision-making, then Homelander isn't just stronger. He's smarter in a way that makes him almost impossible to predict. And that reframes the entire episode, because what we thought was a confrontation might actually have been something else entirely. Not a fight, but a test. Not a clash, but a confirmation. A moment where Homelander isn't trying to win, but is simply observing, measuring, and understanding exactly where everyone stands. And if that's true, then the ending isn't the climax of the story. It's the beginning of something much worse. Because the most dangerous version of Homelander isn't the one who loses control, it's the one who never does. And if Episode 6 is showing us that version for the first time, quietly, subtly, without making a spectacle out of it, then what comes next isn't going to be louder or more chaotic. It's going to be colder, more precise, more inevitable. And by the time the other characters realize what's changed, it might already be too late. And that's where the theory becomes less about what Homelander did and more about what he's becoming. Because if you sit with that ending just a little longer, there's a second layer to it that feels even more disturbing. It's not just that he's calmer. It's not just that he's more controlled. It's that he no longer seems interested in proving anything to anyone. And for a character who has been defined by the need to be seen, to be loved, to be validated, that absence feels unnatural, almost like something has been removed rather than developed. Because growth still leaves traces of the past. Evolution still carries echoes of what came before. But this feels cleaner than that. Sharper. Like a version of Homelander that has been stripped down to only what is necessary. And if that's true, then V1 isn't just an upgrade, it's a filter, a way of removing the noise, the insecurity, the emotional volatility, the need for connection, all the things that made him human enough to understand, and therefore possible to fight. Because once those things are gone, what you're left with isn't just a stronger Homelander, it's a different kind of entity entirely. One that doesn't hesitate, doesn't question, doesn't second guess. And when you go back to the way he looks at Butcher in that final moment, there's something almost analytical about it, like he's not seeing an enemy anymore but a variable. Something to account for, not something to feel about. And that subtle shift changes everything, because it suggests that the conflict between them is no longer personal. It's procedural. And that's a terrifying place for this story to go, because it means the emotional core that has driven the narrative up to this point might not matter anymore, at least not to the person who holds the most power. Butcher is still fueled by rage, by loss, by the need to make this right, but Homelander doesn't seem to need anything anymore. And when a character like that reaches a point where they are no longer driven by desire or fear, they become incredibly difficult to predict, not because they're chaotic, but because they're completely focused. And that brings us back to the ending itself, because what looks like a pause, a moment of stillness between two opposing forces, might actually be something much more deliberate. A checkpoint. A moment where Homelander has already assessed the situation, already calculated the outcomes, already decided what comes next. And instead of acting immediately, he waits, not out of uncertainty, but out of control. Because control isn't about reacting quickly, it's about choosing when to act and, more importantly, when not to. And if that's the case, then Episode 6 isn't showing us a twist in the traditional sense, it's showing us a transition. The point where Homelander stops being a character defined by instability and becomes something far more dangerous, something that operates with intention at every level. And the reason the show doesn't highlight this more aggressively, the reason it lets it sit quietly in the background, is because it wants the audience to feel it before they fully understand it. That unease, that sense that something is off, that something has shifted in a way that hasn't been explained yet, that's the real reveal. Because once you recognize it, once you accept the possibility that Homelander has crossed into this new state, everything else starts to fall into place. The way other characters react without fully knowing why, the way certain moments feel heavier than they should, the way the tension in that final scene doesn't come from what might happen next, but from the realization that what will happen might already be decided. And that's where the fear really settles in, not in the spectacle, not in the violence, but in the inevitability. Because if Homelander now operates with that level of clarity, that level of control, then the story isn't building toward a chaotic explosion. It's building toward something calculated, something precise, something that unfolds exactly the way it was intended to. And the most unsettling part of all is that the other characters, especially Butcher, are still acting within the old framework, still believing that this is a battle of will, of strength, of sacrifice. But if V1 has truly changed Homelander in the way this episode suggests, then those rules no longer apply. And by the time they realize that, by the time they understand that they're not facing the same man they've been fighting all along, it might already be too late to adapt. Because the real twist of episode 6 isn't just that something shocking happened, it's that something fundamental changed, quietly, completely, and without anyone stopping it. And if that change is what it looks like, if this really is the emergence of a version of Homelander that has no internal conflict left, no emotional instability to exploit, no hesitation to slow him down, then what comes next isn't going to feel like a fight. It's going to feel like a plan unfolding, step by step, exactly the way he wants it to. And for the first time in the entire series, that might mean there's no one left who can stop him, not because they're not strong enough, but because they're already too far behind to even understand what they're up against.